I'd like to introduce Brian. He is going to chat to us today about various bits and pieces, but the reason we contacted Brian is he's written a book called Productivity Through Wellness for the Live Entertainment and Theatre Technician, which we all know is an important topic always, but definitely right now. So Brian, going to hand over to you. I'll field Q&A and pass them through to you maybe in the last 5 or 10 minutes of the session.
Sounds perfect. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I hope you don't mind the title. They say put in more words to make more catchphrases come in. So if you don't remember it, don't worry about it. It's like remembering a huge sentence or something. So yeah, rather than going through my bio, I think it's just important to touch base about why I wrote a book on wellness and productivity in our industry. Basically, I was told coming up that working hard was what made me special, and that working long hours was essential to success, and that if I wanted a serious career in the industry, I shouldn't start a family or have any sort of significant outside relationships, and that working in this field is a privilege because I get to do what I want to do. And so I should be willing to sacrifice as much as possible for that. And what I've learned in my 20 or so years of working is that everyone's really lucky to work with us because we're really gifted problem solvers, and we're really great practitioners and talented project managers and craftspeople and artists. And so I felt like it was unfair that we would need to make so much sacrifice for an industry, and that there must be a way to get there that looks after us just as much as we try to look after our projects. It was also spurred by, I've watched a lot of people die before their retirement. My boss developed brain cancer before he could do it. My colleague turned 60, developed cancer, died. There's been car wrecks, there's been suicides. And so my new blessing for everyone is may you all live to enjoy your retirement. And this book is meant to give people, I guess, hope, but also resources and strategies to try and adapt wellness into our workplace and establish it as a productive practice. I want to make it really clear, I don't have this all figured out. I'm still struggling with it. And also, if I were to come forth and tell you that there was some sort of silver bullet, like this is the way to do it, and now we're all going to be fine, I think that would be disingenuous. So if anything, I would hope that this is the beginning of a broader conversation that I think our industry is having that will hopefully lead to some positive change for all of us. So with that in mind, I've got a little PowerPoint presentation here. I'm going to drop into it for a bit, and then we'll hopefully get to some questions when we're done here. So for starters, I think one of the things we need to keep in mind is that our industry is very project-based, and because of that, we focus on the matter at hand and don't think in terms of the long game. We're sort of like, what do we need to do in this moment? And so we start thinking in terms of, I'll make sacrifices now because this project will end and then I'll be able to make up for it. So that idea of like, oh, I just need to finish this project and then I'll sleep. But then at the same time, the gigs are sort of opportunities, right? We don't know what's coming. So it's hard to make that long game plan. And so we might be wrapping up that exhausting gig and then another opportunity comes up. Now we say, oh, I can't say no to that. I don't want to be sort of not thought of for next time. So it starts feeling like the schedule is less in our control and more that we're sort of succumbing to whatever the schedule demands. And so those promises to ourselves to take care of ourselves get pushed back depending on what the opportunities are. And I think that as we look at this, each of us is our own small business, right? It's, you know, if we're freelancers, the small business is us. If we are project managers or production managers, you know, we are running a business, but we're making our own decisions about schedules. We have a lot of agency in these moments. And when we're making these sort of decisions, one of the things that I think comes to mind is the what I call the good, fast, cheap triangle. A lot of people have referred to it this way before. It's basically the notion of you can have a good, fast, or cheap, but pick two. That's a very popular sort of sentiment over here in the US. I imagine you have something similar over there. But if we take that notion and break it down a little bit, I have not met the audience that is fine with a not good product, right? The audience very rarely says, well, I spent money, but you know, they were clearly busy, it's okay. So if we're going to assume that it must be a good product, then we can break time and money down into these other resources of, you know, there's money to buy materials, there's linear time that we need, but there's also people in that equation. And how we manage people in that becomes a really important part of this conversation, because not all resources are the same. If I gave you $1, right, we would say, okay, well, thank you, that's great. If it was a clean, crisp dollar or a crinkled up, dirty dollar, we wouldn't care, because $1 is $1. If I said you got 10 minutes to do this, it probably doesn't matter to you if that's 11 to 11:10 or 11:40 to 11:50, right? Like the resources are very similar. But when it comes to people, it's very, very different. The skill sets of one person might be different than another. And in that way, okay, there's differences, right? If you've got someone who's an experienced welder, you put them on a wood project, that's going to take a different amount of time. I think many of us wrap our head around that. But it's easy to forget that we as individuals are different day to day. If I came into this meeting and, you know, I was hungover because I had gone to the sort of dinner that normally happens the night before or something like that, and I was slurred, I was like, listen, I haven't slept in 4 days, you would get a very different presentation than you're getting today. And that's a difference from me to me. And so one of the things that we can do as managers and as, you know, small business owners for ourselves is consider the fact that if we want to really optimize the work of our employees or ourselves, we need to make sure that we are creating working conditions that are optimal. If anyone's ever worked on a really tough gig, you may have heard or said, oh, hey, I'm not a machine, I can't do that, right? Well, the human body kind of is a machine, and we don't ask machines to do what we're asking ourselves to do, right? Machines require fuel, just like we do. We need food, right? Machines require maintenance, so do we got to exercise. But the other thing is that machines require downtime. It's referred to as a duty cycle. And the human body also requires that. But one of the things that I find is that, especially when stuff starts getting rough, we start running behind, we start trying to ignore the duty cycle of the human body. I speculate that it's because we're really passionate about the product, or we're really invested, or our identity is part of that. We want to make sure that everyone's happy with us. But there are some serious consequences to just pushing forward duty cycle be damned, right? First of all, if we start doing that, there are a bunch of direct costs associated with this. I'm not sure about the rates in New Zealand, but in the US, if you start working over 8 hours and you're on a union gig, you start earning time and a half. You get past 12 hours, you start paying double time. So that's effectively bonus money for hours that you could have gotten normally if you had worked straight time or in sort of a normal way. So that's wasted funding if we could find a way to schedule it differently. There's also the direct costs of keeping an organization running. I think that many of the people that I work with don't actually see those costs. They don't see the cost of keeping the building open past a certain point or anything, but it is a cost to be mindful of if you're ever an owner. And then there's also, if people start working past these points, they're going to start getting sloppy. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But there can be some serious injuries that stem from overwork. I hope that no one has experienced that, but I have definitely seen a lot of people getting hurt because they pushed too far and didn't give themselves enough rest. And beyond that, there's the indirect costs with this. There's, you know, losses of funding due to poor customer service. In our industry, that could be client interaction, right? The CEO comes and starts getting in your face about how this industrial is going to go, and you blow up at them, and then all of a sudden, you know, you lose that gig next time, right? Absenteeism because people are injured or sick. Turnover at your own organization because there's poor morale about the workplace. Wasted time due to lack of efficiency or mistakes. My sort of go-to for this is I used to work in a scene shop, and I walked off stage to the work cage to grab the tools and then went, what the heck did I come here for? and turned around, got back to the gig, looked at it, went, oh, right, a hammer. I went back, got the hammer. And that was all just wasted time that starts playing out because of my exhaustion. There's also wasted materials due to errors. If anyone's ever had to redo something because someone built it backwards, you know what I'm talking about. And also just the labor costs of redoing mistakes. You laid out something and it's, a meter or two off position. And now all of a sudden you need to move that thing. That's more labor that we're putting in due to these mistakes. So I think that one of the things that sort of helps is to understand what the general frame of reference is, or some management guidelines to think about as we're trying to schedule ourselves and others. So I pulled these from some different resources, which hopefully you'll find useful. If you have physical labor going on, this is active, you're up, you're moving around, maybe you're hanging electrics, maybe you're building things with your hands, something along those lines. You can get about 40 hours a week of work productively, where an hour is basically equal to an hour. Once you start going past that, you start becoming less productive. We'll talk about that in a moment. Knowledge work is work where you are making decisions, where you are managing people, perhaps you're doing calculations. Anything where you're sort of trying to put a schedule together would be an example on this. The threshold there is 30 hours. So if we have 30 hours of productive time in a 40-hour work week, what does that look like? We had an article that came out in the US, and it was businesses clamping down on the internet because they were saying, oh, our workers are wasting all this time. They're going on to Facebook. They're looking for other jobs. They're doing it over at the water cooler. And what they were finding is that 25% of the time was being wasted in those workplaces. And that's because they had 40-hour work weeks and they were asking people to do knowledge work, right? So it just falls into inefficiency or malaise, or just sort of a breaking contact with the work. In general, don't go past 10 hours a day. You would want to take breaks as needed. Generally speaking, I go for about 2 hours, and then ensure and consistent sleep schedule. I mentioned this one in particular. We're going to talk about sort of the rules of sleep and why they're important a little bit later. But the big reason I think of this is if anyone's worked at a company where they expect you to load in during the course of the day, and then they want you to gear shift to a night shift, and now you're sort of running the show in the evenings, and then the next day they want you to come in by day and start shifting. That's that sort of sleep schedule irregularity that can do harm and to affect that productivity. Basically, the transition has to do with circadian rhythm, which we'll talk about a little bit. But people want to be on a fairly consistent sleep schedule, and if you mess with that, you'll start affecting their productivity. And in terms of the long game on this, there's some research that helps us capture this. Now, I want to be really clear that the research that I've been garnering has been coming from the medical industry, military, trucking, construction, firefighting. There's not a lot of studies that I have found that are directly focused on live entertainment. But hey, I'm also a researcher, so maybe I'll put one together and we'll do a panel on that in a couple of years. But in the meantime, a study found that 8 60-hour work weeks were as productive as 8 40-hour work weeks. And similarly, they found that 3 80-hour work weeks were as productive as 3 40-hour work weeks. Now, this study that I've listed here, you can feel free to take a screenshot, track it down for yourself. There has been a lot of back and forth in the research community about it, but there are articles that are more recent that are saying, hey, this stands up. So I'm happy to answer questions on that down the road if necessary. But I think that if we think about that, how much money did we spend on those extra 20 hours a week, regardless of whether or not it was overtime, right? I mean, in this sort of instance, that's an extra 4 work weeks worth of money in a 60-hour work week that we spent for no perceivable payoff, right? Or no exceptional bonus. I also think that these hour schedules are not uncommon, right? I mean, an 80-hour work week, that's what? 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, right? Thereabouts. A 60-hour work week is 5 12-hour days. I've heard that before. I've heard that and then some, right? So I think that this is very much happening in live entertainment. And I want to make it clear that it doesn't mean that you can never go over 30 or 40 hours, right? You absolutely can. And in the short term, even if, you know, an hour isn't quite equal to an hour, right? You're starting to get like, you know, 3/4 of an hour's productivity out of it. You might need that in that last minute burst into tech or load in or to open the show. But you need to build in some recovery time to equalize, because if you don't do that and you just make it a pattern, that's where you start seeing these sort of bigger issues. I don't know how the sort of standard work week works where many of you are operating, but I met a company who their whole business model was, we're going to hire you for 60 hours a week because our hourly rate is pretty bad, but by upping the number of hours, now all of a sudden the salary starts looking pretty good. But I think that the downside was they didn't realize what a loss they were just in, like building into, they were scheduling into their own workplace, right? So that's a big part of this. Now, when we start talking about pushing the envelope or trying to get more from our employees, it's very rare that I meet people that say, hey, I want you to skip lunch and dinner in order to get this done, right? Like that is sort of not the area that I see people really pushing the envelope. However, sleep kind of on the chopping block often, right? I don't know if that's because it feels not productive, or it feels like a, you know, well, you know, you can always get more sleep, right? Or I don't know what it is. But when people start saying, hey, listen, can you stick around for a couple of extra hours? Hey, can we, you know, we're going to do an overnight call over here. Are you cool with that? Right? Those are the decisions to start sacrificing sleep. And that can be extraordinarily dangerous, right? Lack of sleep leads to heart disease, obesity, a lot of factors that come into that. So what I often find is that there's a lot of misunderstanding around sleep and how it works. So I'm just going to share some of the rules of sleep here as we operate. For starters, there's a lot of research out there that sort of establishes that the amount of sleep that you need is going to be connected to your physiology, right? So on average, if you're 18 to 25, you probably need 7 to 9 hours of sleep at night. If you're 26 to 64, same boat. But there are outliers, right? There are some people who can get by with 6 hours of sleep. There are some people who need 11 hours of sleep, right? It's all sort of varies. And I've actually been in circumstances where people sort of get in these sort of pissing contests about who can get by with less sleep. And, you know, like, oh, I don't need 8 hours of sleep. I can do 7. Oh, I can do 6.5. By bragging about this, you're basically, it's like bragging about your eye color, right? Like, it's not up to you how much sleep you need. That is your physiology. So I would ask that people just think of it in terms of like, what do you actually need? If you don't know how much sleep you need, the guideline would be, if you were to just lay down on vacation and get a normal night's sleep, how much would it be? You can also use these great trackers. There's a lot of technology out there to help you figure that out. But if anyone starts telling you that they need less than 6 hours of sleep, it's very unlikely. They've probably gotten by without that much sleep. But in terms of the physical need, that's a different threshold. And I think it's important to identify why getting the full amount of sleep is important. A typical evening involves 5 sleep cycles, all right? And these 5 sleep cycles restore your body and your mind. Non-REM sleep is the stuff that restores your body. And REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep, it's like a deepest sleep, that restores your mind. What I did not know until doing this research is that the amount of REM sleep you get in a given sleep cycle isn't the same. So the first couple of cycles really prioritize non-REM sleep or restoring your body. This is why naps often leave us feeling rejuvenated, right? You're like, oh, I feel so sore, whatever. You take a 30-minute nap, you feel better, or a 90-minute nap, you feel better. But if we start hacking off the back end of our sleep, we start losing significant amounts of our REM sleep. I mean, that's almost 50% of your REM sleep in the last cycle, right? So if you say, normally I need 7.5 hours, I'm going to go with 6 today, well, you've just lost a huge amount of your mental recovery. And that's the stuff that's going to help you mitigate stress. That's the stuff that's going to maintain alertness. That's the stuff that's going to give you your ability to stay focused on things. So even if your body is feeling much, much better, you might still feel mentally weighed down by using that technique. And if you start doing it a lot, you start incurring sleep debt. Now, many of you might say, well, Brian, thanks for bringing that to my attention. I have never gotten a full night's sleep, and now I think I'm going to be in sleep debt for forever. Good news is there's a threshold here, or a limit, right? You're going to get a maximum of 20 hours of sleep debt, depending on how bad your sleep schedule is, right? So that is the number that you're banking right now if you're one of these people who has never gotten a fair amount of sleep. You can restore sleep debt by getting extra sleep in 1.5 to 2 hour increments, right? So if you lost 8 hours of sleep over the course of a week, you could get an extra 3 to 4 on Saturday and Sunday and sort of recover, right? If you're down to 20, you might need to schedule a vacation or something to get caught up. But I think until that sleep debt is recovered, you're always going to be working slightly less efficiently, right? So this is what I meant by, if you start pushing the envelope in that sort of tech sort of load-in period, building in recovery time to sort of get the sleep back that you're missing is important. And I also want to call out that your circadian rhythm is going to have an impact on when you can sleep, right? So this right here is a typical circadian rhythm. You can see that there's a low point in alertness around 3:30 a.m., then a high point around 12:30. I don't know if you're all on military times. I don't know if that's 15 o'clock and 18 o'clock, but that sort of arc pattern is the pattern of alertness that we experience. I like to note that 3 p.m. slot, we often hear called the food coma, where it's like, oh, I had lunch and now I'm tired. It's like, it's not actually the lunch, it's the fact that you're in this circadian rhythm lull. And if you're a morning person, you would take all these lines and move them forward by about an hour. And if you're an evening person, you would push it back a little bit, right? And you can reprogram your circadian rhythm, but if you're working off of it or in these sort of areas where there's a natural lull, that's going to be a harder time for solid decision making. So if you've ever worked on a show where they say close, at midnight, and then they want you to strike, you might be in this sort of dearth of alertness, which can make things more dangerous. So as you're trying to schedule, these are sort of factors to keep in mind. I did mention that sleep can affect stress levels. And stress levels are also a big factor in terms of people's productivity, more from a motivational perspective. So I just want to take a moment to talk about this as well. Not all stress is bad. Stress is there to help heighten your capability to do things. And that would be called eustress. Distress is the bad stuff, right? Distress is the stuff that's doing you harm. Acute stress is stress that is happening in this moment. And that is very common, right? That's part of our sort of biological prerogative to respond to threat. Chronic stresses are the stresses that are ongoing. And those are some that can eventually lead to burnout and have an impact on our ability to get things done. And it really comes down to this notion of alarm or exposure to alarm, then resistance to that alarm, and over a prolonged period that can lead to exhaustion. To help sort of demonstrate this, I have this courtesy of the Oak Ridge Center in England. And you can see that there's sort of a healthy range of responses where there's a threat, and then our muscles tense, and then we prepare for fight or flight. We either fight and then or flight or do whatever we need to do to normalize, or things relax, and then we're sort of out of the stressful situation. In that circumstance, we have had a healthy sort of bout with stress. But if the stress doesn't go away, then those bodily reactions continue. And that can start leading to, think of it like being on adrenaline all the time, right? It affects your concentration, affects your health. you start becoming sensitized, which means that each time you are exposed to this stressor, you become hypervigilant about it. It has a more pronounced impact than before. So you either get out of that stressful situation or just completely change your mental approach. Now, when I think of stressful situations, a lot of things come to mind, witnessing violence, a car crash or something like that might be an example, but it doesn't have to be that extreme. If you've got a client who yells at you and puts you in a really stressful situation, well, that's not a physical stress, it's a mental stress, right? Certainly affects your well-being, your ability to move forward. If you've got a circumstance where you've got a certain coworker who harasses you, and every time you come to work, you have to deal with that harassment. That would be a stressor that is not going to go away, right? Each time you see this person who is making your life difficult, things become more stressful. So as managers, as we're thinking about productivity and health and what have you, if we expect to put our employees into stressful circumstances, like with high stress clients or in really tight turnarounds, we want to be extra careful to make sure that they're getting enough recovery period, that they don't get into this sort of chronic habit of it. And one of the things I think could be really problematic about the industry is a lot of times people who do a really great job are then put in that situation over and over again, right? Oh, this person dealt with that really stressful circumstance. So here's another really stressful circumstance. This person we know can do it. Let's throw them right into it. And I think it's important for us to think about how often can they do that? Are they stressed about it? Are they getting enough recovery time? One of the case studies from my book has there's a gentleman who worked in an AV industry, and they would get about a week. They would show up, they would get a week, and then they would have to present to stockholders or what have you. And he said it was the most stressful week every time it had to happen, because the CEO is in your face saying, I've spent millions of dollars on this and it's all on you for this to go. So he would spend time checking and rechecking, make sure this thing goes smoothly. Said he would break out in hives as the show approached because he was so nervous about whether or not it would go well. And he stayed with that company for years because the company understood that that week was the most valuable, expensive, revenue generating week they could ask of him. So when he got home, he got 2 weeks off, period, paid weeks off. And if he said, listen, I'm not quite ready to come back to work, then they would say, fine, stay away as long as you want. You still have a job. When you come back, let us know and we'll get you back into it, right? They would routinely give him agency and let him know he was appreciated, to sort of reinforce his psyche and make sure that he did not get overwhelmed with distress so that he could do that event as it came up. So that sort of notion of just honoring what it is we're asking people to do and trying not to overbook, I think, is a key part of it. And in terms of us in this meeting here and us trying to get this session together, my challenge for all of us is to think about, as managers and as self-schedulers and as leaders in the field, where can we exert control? What agency do you have in these moments? One of the things that I think many of us do is we get caught up in the ask. And we get, the client comes to us and they say, we want this, this, and this, and then we assume that that's sacrosanct. And it's almost like a result of the sort of Amazon shopping or the Alibaba shopping, like I ordered this, I get exactly this, and I get it now, instead of honoring the fact that we're in the prototyping industry. Right? Like each project is somehow its own, is somehow unique, and is somehow different from the others. Are you at an organization where you can have conversations leading into it about emergencies and get them fixed, right? Hey, we thought it was going to cost this. All of a sudden there was a storm. Now lumber prices are through the roof. We now need to reassess how we're going to do this. Are you open to that conversation? If someone offers you a gig, and you see that it's on the heels of this other one, can you carve out time to recover? Perhaps after that second gig, right? You get to make your own choices about But more than anything, I think it's important that we not feel victims to the schedule or victims to the industry and recognize our own places for control. And there's a lot of pressure in there. Like I'm saying that to you, and I'm sure some of you are looking at me like, what are you talking about? I did a presentation on this very topic because this topic isn't exclusive to live entertainment, right? Like this is, I'm not sure if it's a result of a global economy or what. But I sat down with the president of a university, head of HR, head of facilities, and I gave a very similar presentation to this. And the head of HR said, well, look, this is ridiculous. You can't expect me to tell people I'm not available. You can't expect me to tell people, oh, we can't do that window of time, right? If a parent calls, I have to answer the phone. Head of facilities over here can't possibly tell people not to call them. And the head of facilities went, oh, I totally tell people not to call them. They said, what? It's like, yeah, if it's not a fire or an explosion, everyone else can handle it until I can get back. That's it. And so there's a lot of pressure that I feel that we put on ourselves that isn't explicit, but we just assume it's part of the deal that might in fact not be there. There are very few employers I know who want to take on the liability of a bunch of people working without sleeping for like 24 hours or something. But we just assume that it's part of it because we've said we're going to deliver something. So while that's not a directive per se, and some circumstances are different, right? I've heard about Fashion Week. In Fashion Week, they buy screw guns because they expect to use them until they burn out so they can throw them out and use the next one because they're just not going to stop, right? So I understand that there are circumstances, but doing what you can to make sure that you build in recovery around those events, I think is the key sort of area of agency that I would encourage you all to go for. So, I mean, that's the sort of PowerPoint aspect to this. I do want to take some time and answer questions that might have stemmed from this. I do want to take time and address any sort of motivational questions that might come from this, or even just hear stories, you know, as necessary. Whatever you need from this experience, I'm here for you. If you're at this panel, unless you were lost, you're here because you're dealing with this stuff, right? So I'm eager to be here as a resource and help. So with that in mind, if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Not seeing any in the Q&A screen at this point, assuming you can all hear me. I don't know if there's any in the chat screen. I can't see that. And if anyone wants their mics live, and if you raise your hand, we can make that happen as well, I believe.
While we're waiting, you just interrupt me if someone shows up. One of the things that I want to encourage everyone to do is put together estimates and then track them. One of the areas that I think gets real dicey is when we see a gig and we just say, oh yeah, I think we can do it. And if we haven't put together an estimate in advance, we have no frame of reference of what we're actually asking ourselves to do. So that can be a really useful tool as we're trying to get this done.
I need to say on a personal level, I mean, so much of what you've said actually hits home. And I think we're all guilty of putting ourselves in a number of those situations. So I think we can all learn from this. And, you know, I'd love to actually, yeah, I'd love to explore this further as well. Now we've got someone with their hand up. We've got someone out in our little mothership that can liven that microphone. Unsure who that was with their hand up, but if you try and speak, we might be able to hear you. Also, Andrew, I see that you've popped up a link to Brian's book. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that very much. And if you like it, please let me know. And if you don't like it, please let me know. If there's stuff that you wish I covered and I didn't, let me know. I'm very accessible.
Okay. who was that had their hand raised? If you can raise your hand again, we can allow you to talk. I think we missed that briefly. I think it times out. Message here from Jenna, that was awesome. The start of a conversation we need to have, most definitely. And actually it's a conversation we've been having for quite a long time, but it's nice to hear it from another
I also want to voice that a lot of times we think that we're the only ones thinking about this. We're asking our artists to do a lot too, right? I had a conversation with directors, and they feel the same pressure here because they have to go gig to gig to gig. Designers, I mean, they're going tech to tech to tech to tech in order to stitch together an income, right? So it's not exclusive. It's a problem across the board. And I think that a lot of times we think other people will be closed to the conversation because they asked us to do this at all, right? Like, oh, well, they're asking me to clock these times. Clearly, they don't care. But I think a lot of times they don't realize what the ask is, and we don't articulate it. Now, in commercial, I think it gets a little bit better because a lot of people get real specific with a contract. But I think that there is opportunity here to really reset things. And I think it's equally true. I don't know how many of you are working in film. I mean, film gets even more sort of banana cakes in terms of schedule, right? Because there's so many different factors that you have to deal with. There's in my book, I addressed the fact that the union had made a rule that you were required to have 8 hours off after a shift, which sounds great until each shift starts going an hour longer because they needed that extra hour on site, and all of a sudden that 8 hours keeps creeping. And so, you started the day at 11 o'clock on a Monday, and now all of a sudden you're starting it at 11 o'clock at night on Sunday because everything's been shifting over. So there's room for improvement.
Right, we've got a couple of questions that have popped up in the question box. I don't know if you can see the Q&A box as well there, Brian. You may not be. Bear with me while I try and see it. Can you see those?
Yes. With COVID here, companies are cutting back on staff. I think we may have taken a step backwards in terms of hours staff worked and days off. Yeah, that is one of the things I was really nervous about with COVID was that things would open back up and companies would say, well, we've taken such a hit. So clearly we can't afford to do things the way that we used to. So you're going to have to do even more with even less. Sorry, and that we would have been out of work for long enough that we would go, whatever, I'll do whatever. And all of a sudden we're taking a step backwards, right? I would say that it does continue. The conversation is very much going on right now. We're actually later in opening up than all of you are because you did a much better job. I'm happy to say that. But anyway, so we're starting to open back up. And one of the big conversations that's going on, we have do you do 10 out of 12s? Do we have this conversation? There's an actors union that requires or sets a limit, says actors can work no more than 10 out of 12 on these certain tech days, right? So over a 12-hour period, they're working 10 hours. Well, what that turns into for designers is like 14 out of 16 or 16 out of 18 or just 18, because like that block of time that the actors are off, you're doing notes and you're showing up in advance to prep, and then you stick around afterwards for all the post-show notes, etc. So we have an organization called No More 10 out of 12s that is having a national conversation about hours. And while they have focused on that one topic, it is sort of bringing attention to the entire factor, right? The whole way it goes. I also, I know that there are a lot of universities who are having this conversation. One of the things that I was saying to Vicki in a previous meeting, many of us, shocker, do what we're trained. And so if our teachers had told us, you can't have a relationship, you have to work nonstop, your only value is how long can you work, we're going to buy into that. We're going to make that our new workplace. So I know that a lot of universities are trying to reshape that culture. And a lot of that's actually coming from the younger generations here who are going, this is ridiculous, right? Like So I'm really grateful for that conversation going on. But I do think that in a way, those companies, the companies that are making these backward steps, maybe it's a matter of just having the conversation, because a lot of times they're wasting money by doing it anyway. Once they figure that out, then all of a sudden you've got inroads. So I'm happy to say that the conversation is going on here. It is certainly not resolved, and I am still nervous about how that conversation will go. But hopefully, by us just being here, that's the beginning, right? That's the beginning of bringing awareness. I actually thought the whole market for my book would be people pissed at their manager over scheduling them. That they would just slam the book down and be like, read it. That would be my whole market. I see here a thank you for the presentation. You're welcome. This is an issue everywhere. Our industry is largely contractor based, so is ours. Many contractors going from gig to gig with no downtime. Yeah. I very much agree with you. You know, one of the things that we've been talking about too is that how expensive it is to go gig to gig. Because now you sort of can't go home and cook for yourself, and you can't sort of take, like, you're now spending money on cabs to get back at 2 in the morning, and you know, all the sort of food factors are now you're ordering out nonstop and all this, right? So yeah, I think that in a way, you know, I'm not going to tell anyone how to schedule themselves, but as contractors, the good news is you have some serious agency in terms of what you say yes to. Now, you may have financial parameters that make it really hard to say no to things, and I fully get that. But you know, maybe hopefully that's helpful, because it's not like someone is demanding that you do this stuff. How would I work to tackle this situation? I would write a book about it and then present at the ETNZ to make sure to broaden awareness. No, I think it's hard to answer that question because each organization has different needs. What I would say is make sure that management, all right, a lot of people when they look at work-life balance problems start telling the individual how they individually can make it better, right? Oh, all you need to do is get more sleep and exercise. Very few people have the conversation about, like, what is management asking? And how is that impacting the individual's ability to take care of themselves? So one of the things I would do is I would have conversations with managers. I would say, hey, listen, you know, for my health, I am looking to try and do this in a new schedule. Is there a way for us to move forward where I have these limits? I would establish boundaries. I would try to unpack all the tacit agreements. Tacit agreements like, hey, if I call, I expect you to pick up no matter what time it is, right? If you say, listen, just so you know, if you call me between 10 p.m. and 8 a.m. the next day, I'm not going to pick up. So you need to text me if it's super urgent. Otherwise, expect me to get back to you the next day, right? Like, take those tacit agreements and articulate them so that they establish boundaries for yourself. Because in my area, if you call to get like cable set up for your home or something like that, they'll say, okay, we'll show up sometime between 8 a.m. and 9 p.m. And you go, ugh. But you're only really mad if they show up before or after the time because they've managed your expectations. Do what you can to help manage those leaders' expectations, and make sure that you're giving them agency in it too. Make sure you understand the need. You know, you could even say, if you need me to come in for 60 hours, 70 hours, 80 hours, that's fine, but just you're going to need to build in, some recovery time after that. And let's talk about what that looks like. Who knows what's possible, depending on how that conversation goes. There's a performer named Misbehave, runs a Misbehave game show in Vegas. She says, you never get anything without asking. I think it's a pretty good way to think about it. The timeframes and venues are a big issue. They have overtime, so 12 to 16-hour days are pretty normal. Yeah, I think you're right that the venue tends to be the most expensive cost, and that's the thing the producer wants to not lose money on the most. But if this math is correct, by working 12 to 16 hours, they're not actually getting 12 to 16 hours of productivity either. So the other part of it is maybe adjusting scope or making sure that we're real about what we're going to get in that window of time. That's where I think the estimates and actual come in. And you're right, this is a big conversation to have with producers and with the folks that are funding the projects to make sure they understand it. Yeah, I appreciate the comment about it's important for crew to talk about hours worked. I think it's important to talk about salary. I think that the only way that we bring each other together is by being really public about what it is that we're being asked to do and how we're being asked to do it. I think it's also an equity thing, like gender equity, and we need to build into our budgets feeding people. Film and TV does this well. Yeah, no, I would love that, right? Like I often say, you can tell how good the gig is by how much food is there and how good it is, right? So I can tell I made it when I got this really great spread from the, from the film people.
We're just about at the end of our time, but what I'd like to say to everyone out there is I've had on my list of things to do for a long time, writing a wellness guide to sit under ETNZ. So if anyone on this panel wants to get involved and stuck in that, please contact me and Brian. I think we'd love to stay in touch. Actually, I think this is a subject that we can keep working through, maybe invite you back for some other sessions.
I would love that. And thank you all so much for giving so much of your time to this and for committing to your own health and for the health of your friends and those who might be coming after us. So thank you so much.
And it's just been fantastic to meet you and establish this relationship between you and ETNZ and all these people. So thank you so much. And yeah, we'll definitely be in touch in the very, very near future.
I look forward to it. Have fun on the floor, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you.